Piper Landry was just the flight nurse everyone assumed had ridden along for the medicine, not the flying. Then the pilot's hands went slack on the cyclic at 4,000 feet over open canyon, and the entire crew found out exactly who'd been sitting in that left seat the whole time. Piper Landry reported to Meridian Air Rescue on a Tuesday morning with a duffel bag over one shoulder, and a logbook she never mentioned to anyone tucked inside it. She was 29, 5'6", and she entered rooms quietly, eyes forward, taking up as little space as possible. Nobody stood up. Nobody offered a hand. A couple of medics glanced at her badge, glanced away, and went back to their coffee. Meridian's helicopter program had a reputation. It flew the worst terrain in the region: canyon rescues, backcountry trauma. Patients and ambulance couldn't reach in time, and the crews who worked it were not shy about reminding new arrivals how much that terrain had already tried to kill people less careful than them. The other nurses on shift that first week were friendly enough in passing, but nobody made the effort to actually pull her into anything. Piper didn't chase it. She'd learned a long time ago that chasing acceptance cost more than it ever paid back. Wade Delgado ran the flight roster with the easy authority of a man who'd logged 11 years, and never once doubted himself at the controls. He glanced at Piper's file, checked her certifications, and said, "Landry, you're riding with me for orientation. Try to keep up with the terrain briefings. This isn't flat ground flying." Wade's greeting wasn't unkind, exactly. It also wasn't a welcome. "You ever actually been in a helicopter before this job?" Wade asked her on her second week, not cruelly, just carelessly, already certain the target wouldn't push back. Or did they just hand you the cert after the classroom part? A couple of the medics laughed. Piper said nothing at all. What the crew didn't know, what Piper had never once mentioned, not in her interview, not over coffee, not anywhere it wasn't strictly required, was where she'd actually come from, and what she'd almost become before any of them ever met her. She'd grown up outside a small airfield in eastern Oregon, the daughter of a crop duster pilot who ran a small helicopter alongside his fixed-wing work for herding cattle across the back 40, which meant Piper had real stick time on a rotor long before she ever touched the controls of anything with wings. Her father taught her to read wind before she could properly read a book, how a gust moves through wheat before you feel it on your skin, how a stall doesn't announce itself so much as it whispers, and if you're not listening, you miss it until it's too late to matter. By 17 she had a private pilot's license. The plan after that never wavered: fighters. Something happened between that plan and the woman standing in Meridian's crew lounge 2 years ago. Something Piper had never once explained to anyone on this base. She didn't quit aviation. She just found the only door still open to her, became a flight medic instead of a pilot, then a flight nurse. Riding in the back of aircraft close enough to the work to still feel it in her chest every time the rotors spun up. Nobody at Meridian knew what had closed the other door. It wasn't shame. It was simply math she'd done a long time ago. What it would cost to explain, weighed against what it would cost to be underestimated a little longer, and the second number had always come out smaller. She still remembered the first time her father let her take the helicopter's controls solo over the back pasture. 12 years old, barely able to see over the panel, his voice steady in her headset the whole time. "Feel it before you see it," he told her. "The gauges will always be a half-second behind the truth." She hadn't understood what he meant until years later, in a cockpit that wasn't a crop duster at all, with 2 men's lives depending on whether she remembered the lesson correctly. The weeks at Meridian moved slow through each shift, blurred looking backward. Terrain briefings before dawn, trauma protocols that ran late into the afternoon, landing zone drills in wind that made even the senior medics grip their harnesses a little tighter. Piper kept pace through all of it, never flashy, never behind. What the crew didn't see was what she did after everyone else went home. She spent hours alone in the hangar's flight planning room studying weather patterns for the canyon routes, cross-referencing wind shear reports against actual incident data. The way some people study a language they intend to speak fluently. She read every accident report in the program's safety library, not because she was assigned to, but because she wanted to understand every way a good crew could still lose an aircraft, so that she never would. She kept her own private logbook current, in a way nobody flying a desk would have any reason to check. Noting weather, terrain, decisions she'd have made differently if the seat had been hers. There was one flight in October that nobody at Meridian would remember but her. They were inbound to a rural trauma scene. Wade at the controls, when the aircraft hit an unexpected downdraft rolling off the canyon wall. The kind of gust that shows up in the data as a footnote, and shows up in a cockpit as a stomach drop nobody wants to feel twice. Wade corrected late, overcorrected hard, and for 3 full seconds the aircraft yawed in a way that made the medic in the back grab for a handhold. Piper felt it before the instruments caught up to it. The pressure change, the specific way the rotor noise shifted pitch a half second before the airframe actually responded. She knew exactly what correction the moment needed. She said nothing. It wasn't her aircraft. It wasn't her place. Wade corrected it himself 2 seconds later. Later than she would have. Rougher than she would have, and the flight continued without incident. Nobody else on board flagged it as a close call at all. Piper wrote it in her own logbook that night in 4 short lines. The same way her father had taught her to log every flight honestly, mistakes included. She never mentioned the downdraft to anyone. She told herself it hadn't mattered, because nothing had actually gone wrong. She would think about those 3 seconds again. Much later, under circumstances that made the silence far harder to forgive herself for. Wade never knew any of that had happened. He flew the rest of that day the same as ever, confident, capable, entirely unaware that the quiet woman in the back had clocked his mistake before he'd finished making it, and decided it wasn't hers to correct out loud. The call came in at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon. A logging accident 40 minutes into the backcountry. A worker with a crushed chest and a collapsing lung. Weather closing in faster than the forecast had promised that morning. Wade ran the pre-flight the way he always did, fast, confident. Dismissive of the 2 lines on Piper's weather printout that showed the ceiling dropping faster over the ridge than the valley station was reporting. "We'll be in and out before it matters," he said. Already climbing in. Piper didn't argue. She'd learned that arguing with Wade before a flight cost time the patient didn't have, and it rarely changed the outcome anyway. She logged her concern in her own head instead, the way she'd learned to log everything that didn't sit right, and climbed into the back beside her patient bag. The extraction went clean. The worker was stabilized and loaded inside 11 minutes, and they lifted off the logging road with visibility already thinner than it had been on the way in. Gray cloud pressing down against the ridgeline harder than the morning briefing had promised. 6 minutes into the return leg, at 4,000 feet over open canyon, Wade stopped responding. His hands had fallen away from the controls entirely. "Wade." Piper's voice cut through the headset static. No response. His head had tipped forward against the harness. Breathing shallow. One side of his face gone visibly slack even through the mic and helmet. "Cerebrovascular event," Piper said. Already unbuckling. Already moving toward the front of the aircraft with a helicopter losing coordinated control underneath her. "He's stroking out. I need the controls." The medic in back, wide-eyed, keyed his mic. "You're rated for this?" "I'm the only option," Piper said, which wasn't quite an answer, and was also the only one that mattered right now. Her hands found the cyclic and collective like something she'd missed for years without letting herself admit it. The aircraft was drifting right, losing altitude in a slow uncommanded descent that would become a very fast one if she didn't correct it in the next several seconds. She corrected it, cleanly, the way she would have corrected it in October, if it had been her aircraft to correct. The instrument panel in front of her was unfamiliar in the specific way a machine is unfamiliar when you've studied its cousin for years, but never actually touched its controls in flight. Close enough to muscle memory that her hands found what they needed. Foreign enough that every input cost her a half-second of conscious thought a real pilot wouldn't have needed to spend. Meridian Base. This is Air 1. Piper said into the radio. Voice flat and even despite everything happening around her. Pilot incapacitated. Medical emergency in progress. I hold a private rotorcraft endorsement and I am assuming manual control. Requesting immediate guidance to nearest suitable landing zone. The dispatcher's voice cracked back, disbelieving. Say again. Air 1. Who's flying the aircraft? I am. Piper said. Now guide me in. The weather had closed further than the forecast promised. Ceiling dropping toward the ridgeline. Visibility fitting into gray. Piper flew the aircraft the way her father had shown her over unfamiliar fields of dawn. Treating the machine as much as the instrument. Trusting the pressure in her hands over the numbers when the two disagreed. Because a helicopter in deteriorating weather with 2 lives behind her did not forgive hesitation. Behind her. The medic was doing everything he could for both patients now. The logger with the collapsing lung. And Wade. Slumping further with every passing minute. His color going worse. Talk to me, the medic said. What do you need? I need you to keep both of them breathing. Piper said. I've got the aircraft. A gust hit them crossing the canyon rim, not unlike the one in October. Harder, and for 1/2 second the tail kicked sideways in a way that made every warning light on the panel flare at once. Piper's whole body wanted to overcorrect. Hard and fast. The exact mistake Wade had made in October. She didn't. She held the smaller, cleaner correction instead. The one she'd known was right 3 seconds too late to matter back then. And the aircraft settled. Behind her, Wade's breathing had gone more irregular. A thin, uneven sound the medic was tracking against the seconds on his watch. BP's dropping on him too, the medic called forward. I need you down soon. Landry, however soon that actually is. Working on it, Piper said, eyes moving between the instruments and the gray wall of weather ahead. Doing math on ceiling and terrain and airspeed that she hadn't done for real, outside a simulator, in almost 8 years. She found the landing zone dispatch had called out, a wide clearing at a ranger station, flat enough, exposed enough to see the wind sock from a quarter-mile out. She brought the aircraft down in a controlled descent that would have looked, to anyone who actually understood what they were watching, like the work of someone with considerably more than a private pilot's background. The final approach ate up the longest 30 seconds of her life. Rotor wash flattened the grass below in widening rings as she brought the aircraft into a hover 6 feet up, checking drift against the wind sock one last time before committing to the touchdown. The exact sequence she drilled 1,000 times as a cadet and never once expected to need for real. In a machine she'd never been rated to fly. With 2 men's lives riding on getting it exactly right. The skids touched dirt. She didn't feel her hands shaking until the rotors had fully spooled down. For one strange, suspended second, sitting in a seat she'd trained 12 years for and never once been allowed to keep, Piper felt something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief. It didn't last long enough to name properly before the rest of the job pulled her attention back. Ground M's had Wade and the logger both loaded and moving toward the trauma bay within 4 minutes. Piper walking beside the gurney the entire way, calling out vitals and a full neuro assessment to the waiting team with the same flat precision she'd used on the radio. She didn't stop moving until both patients were handed off. Machines connected. The team fully briefed on everything that had happened in the air. Only then did she let herself stand still in the hallway for a moment, hands shaking now that there was nothing left that needed them steady. It was the ranger station's duty officer, watching the whole thing unfold from the clearing, who'd said what 6 people were already thinking. That was not a private pilot's landing. Piper hadn't answered him. She'd already been moving toward the hospital doors. Word travels through a small regional program faster than anyone expects. And by the time Wade came out of the stroke unit's acute phase 48 hours later, Stable. Speech slightly slurred but recovering. Half the base already knew the shape of what had happened even if nobody could say exactly how. The other medic who'd been in back, a steady, unflappable man named Ruiz who didn't usually have much to say about anything, told the story at the crew lounge that first night with a kind of quiet disbelief that made everyone stop what they were doing to listen. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The facts alone did the work. A nurse with no pilot certification, flying a wounded aircraft through closing weather, landing it clean. She didn't even sound scared, Ruiz said, still turning it over. Not once. The whole way down. I was scared enough for both of us and she just sounded like she was reading a checklist. Nobody laughed. The crew lounge sat with it instead. The way a room sits with a fact too large to immediately fold into a joke. Wade asked to see her before he'd say much of anything else. They tell me you flew it in, he said, voice still a little uneven. I did. They also tell me you told dispatch you had a private pilot background. He studied her for a long moment. That the whole story? Piper considered the question fully before answering. No, she said. It's not. She told him the rest of it there in the recovery room. Quietly. Because he'd earned the honest version by nearly dying in the seat next to her. She tested into a service academy on a scholarship nobody in her hometown had heard of. Finished near the top of her class. Aided all the way through primary flight training. And was 2 weeks from finding out whether she'd been picked for the fighter track when the accident ended it instead. The formation exercise had gone wrong fast, a mechanical failure in the aircraft flying wing on her. A scramble to abort clean. A hard landing that put her spine through forces it was never built to absorb even inside a properly executed emergency procedure. She remembered the impact more clearly than she remembered most of the following week in the hospital. And then the long gray stretch of physical therapy that followed. Months of it. All of it aimed at a single question nobody would answer honestly until the very end. Would she ever be cleared again? 3 vertebrae. Badly enough out of alignment that no amount of surgery or physical therapy would ever clear her for high-G flight again. The medical board's letter was 2 paragraphs long. It took her 4 minutes to read it and far longer than that to stop reading it over and over, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something else. The years afterward spent finding the only door still open, flight medic. Then flight nurse. Close enough to the work to still feel it in her chest every time the rotors spun up. Never close enough to actually touch the controls until a Thursday afternoon made the question academic. I never told anyone here because it wasn't relevant, she said. I'm not rated to fly this aircraft. I got lucky that the thing I actually knew how to do was enough. It wasn't luck, Wade said, the words coming slower than usual, his mouth still not fully cooperating. I've flown that ridge in weather like that for 11 years. What you did back there wasn't lucky. It was better than what I'd have done healthy, some days. Piper didn't have an easy answer for that one. She thought about October instead, the downdraft. The correction she'd known and hadn't offered. The silence she'd told herself hadn't mattered because nothing had gone wrong that time. It had been sitting in her logbook for months. 4 short lines nobody else would ever read. And she'd told herself over and over that writing it down honestly was enough. That the silence itself didn't need fixing as long as the record was accurate. Standing here now, with Wade's face still slack on one side, she understood how thin that logic had actually been. There was a flight in October, she said. You caught a downdraft off the canyon wall. I knew the correction a half second before you found it yourself. I didn't say anything, because it wasn't my aircraft to fly. Wade was quiet for a moment. I remember that flight. I remember thinking I'd been sloppy. You weren't sloppy, Piper said. I just should have said something. I'm not going to make that mistake again. Why didn't you? Wade asked. Say something. I mean, back in October. Piper considered the question honestly before she answered it. Because I'd spent a long time learning that being right quietly cost less than being right out loud. Especially around people who'd already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. That was a bad habit to carry into a cockpit. I know that now. He didn't apologize in any grand way. He wasn't built for that, and neither, really, was she. He just said, "Next time you see something, Landry, say it. I don't care whose aircraft it is. Copy that," Piper said, and something in the flatness of it made him almost laugh, despite everything. Nothing dramatic happened in the days that followed. Nobody was fired. Nobody demanded an apology to her. Wade came back to light duty 3 weeks later, cleared for ground instruction before flight status. And the first thing he did was ask the program director to formally document what Piper had done. Not a pilot certificate. Nothing the FAA would ever issue for a program this size. But an internal Meridian qualification that let her legally take manual controls in a declared in-flight emergency. Reviewed and signed off by the base's aviation safety officer. It made what she'd done in the canyon a documented exception instead of an unrepeatable accident of timing. The program director, a careful woman named Alvarez who'd been running Meridian's flight operations for 15 years, sat across from Piper for a full hour going through her old academy transcripts and flight hours. Occasionally shaking her head, a person recalculating an assumption in real time. "You could have told any of us this on day one," Alvarez said eventually. "I could have," Piper said. "It wouldn't have changed what I was actually cleared to do. It would have just changed how people looked at me before I'd earned it." Alvarez didn't have a quick answer for that, and didn't try to invent one. The medic who'd been in back that day, Ruiz, started calling her Landry like a call sign. Half joking, half not. And it stuck around the crew lounge without anyone deciding to make it official. Even the nurses who'd never invited her to anything found small ways to close the distance in the weeks that followed. An extra coffee left at her station some mornings. An invitation to the after-shift bar that she still mostly declined. But that kept coming anyway. It wasn't quite friendship yet. It was a room slowly deciding someone belonged in it. Piper didn't need any of it. She'd flown that aircraft down because 2 men needed her to. Not because she needed anyone in that hangar to finally see her clearly. But she didn't turn the rating down either. When it came through 6 weeks later, because some doors, once they open even partway, are worth walking the rest of the way through. She flew home to Oregon the following spring. Duffel bag over her shoulder. Walking the tarmac quietly the way she always had. Her father's old crop duster still sat leaning in its hangar. Wings dusted with fine dirt. Waiting for a pilot who no longer needed it to fly but still came back to check on it whenever she was home. The little helicopter parked beside it, now mostly retired too, kept running out of habit more than necessity. The airfield hadn't changed much in a decade. The windsock faded to a duller orange than she remembered. The gravel strip that still turned to soup after a hard rain. She'd learned to fly on that strip before she'd learned much of anything else that mattered. And some part of her still measured every other runway she'd ever landed on against it. She didn't say much out there. She never had. She just stood by the wing for a while, hand resting flat against the worn metal. The way you'd greet an old friend who'd taught you something you never had to be told twice. That the sky doesn't care how loud you are walking into a room. It only cares whether you were paying attention the whole time everyone else wasn't. Her father found her there near sundown, the way he always did, and didn't ask what she was thinking about. He just stood beside her a while, hands in his pockets, looking at the same old plane. "Still fly clean?" he asked eventually. "Cleaner than I used to," Piper said. "I finally stopped staying quiet when it mattered." He nodded once. The way he'd nodded at most important things in her life. And they stood there together until the light went down behind the ridge. There's a difference between staying quiet because you're calm, and staying quiet because you've decided your voice doesn't count. Piper spent years mistaking one for the other, and it took nearly losing 2 people to finally tell them apart. Most of us won't get a canyon or a cockpit to force that lesson into focus. We'll just get a meeting. Or a dinner table. Or a quiet moment where speaking up costs less than it feels like it will. It's worth asking which one you're actually doing next time you decide to hold your tongue.